In the Critical Public Conversations series for this year. Before I introduce our wonderful speaker this morning, I'd like to hand over to our very beloved Auntie Di Kerr, who is going to welcome us to country.
Thank you.
And Auntie Di, and I think you're quite right, country is telling us to look out for ourselves at the moment. We've had fires and we've had floods, and it's about time we start paying attention. Thank you, as always. Before I introduce our speaker this morning, just the usual couple of housekeeping notes. Closed captioning has been enabled should you need that. The chat function is disabled, but we would love to hear from you. We would love to have you ask questions during and after the session. So please use the Q&A function for that. We'll have time after Kevin's presentation to hear from your questions. I will now introduce the wonderful Kevin Bruyneel. So Kevin Bruyneel is Professor of Politics at Babson College in Massachusetts. He's the author of Settler Memory, The Disavowal of Indigeneity and the Politics of Race in the United States, published in the Critical Indigeneity series of the University of North Carolina Press in 2021. He presently writes on the relationship between race, colonialism, collective memory, and racial capitalism. He has published articles in History and Memory, Settler-Colonial Studies, Native American and Indigenous Studies Journal, and the Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy. His first book, which I still teach, was The Third Space of Sovereignty, Post-Colonial Politics of US Indigenous Relations. He is of settler ancestry, born and raised in Vancouver, British Columbia, the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Bruyneel completed his BA at Simon Fraser University and his MA and PhD at the New School for Social Research in New York City. At Babson College, he teaches courses in political theory, American politics, critical race studies, Indigenous studies, and radical politics. Kevin has been warned that we are big fans of his work, and we're looking forward to hearing from him this morning. Thanks, Kevin. Over to you.
Thank you so much for this amazing welcome, Auntie, and to everybody at the Australian Centre, Sarah and Claire, Doug, Bianca. This is truly an honor. I mean, it's really an honor to be talking to you all at this particular moment. And I didn't realize, I guess I did realize, but it comes to me that I'm the conclusion of this seminar series. So hopefully I can live up to what's certainly been its high standard. Let me, because we only have an hour together, jump right in. And I'm going to jump right into the Reconstruction era, which is a big jump. And just to be clear about it, because it's one of these eras that gets invoked, but in terms of the specificity of it, this is the era that follows the US Civil War from 1861 to 1865 in the United States. A war fought over many things, including, of course, in the end, to abolish slavery, at least constitutionally, if not in a de facto sense. And so from 1865 or so to 1877, there was an effort to reconstruct America with the United States government occupying the South and seeking to radically reconstruct through Black self-governance, the US according to the lines of substantial, not just political, formal political, but substantial economic and political equality. It's a central memory in US politics with the Reconstruction era. It's the central memory that's invoked to signal the need for radical change. On the left, we don't send out the bat signal, we send out the Reconstruction signal to call out for a better world. But why? In his 1980 address as the president of the American Historical Association, John Hope Franklin spoke about the Reconstruction era, and he said, if every generation rewrites its history, as various observers have often claimed, then it may be said that every generation since 1870 has written the history of the Reconstruction. And what historians have written tells us as much about their own generation as about the Reconstruction period itself. The title of his address was Mirror for Americans, a Century of Reconstruction History. The metaphor of the mirror speaks to how in the Reconstruction era, each generation sees what it wants to see what it needs to see in order to intervene in and define the imperatives of their time and to think about how to make a better world, something that Auntie talked about, and I agree with her, it's possible. In our time, the political memory of the Reconstruction era is important fuel for writers, scholars, activists, and movements to address the present and future of race, anti-racism, economic justice, and radical political transformation. As if serendipitously, as if just out of the blue and out of the sky, the New York Times op-ed page helped to make my point. Today, and this is an assignment for anybody who wants to check and read this piece, Jamelle Bouie, probably the best, strongest, I think most interesting and important, politically insightful columnist for the New York Times op-ed, today has an op-ed, today in our time, October 25th here in Massachusetts. It's titled, "Why I Keep Coming Back to Reconstruction." And the picture he has there is of W.E.B. Du Bois. We keep invoking it time after time after time when we want to invoke radical change. So, and also it's a really good piece, although I think it also maybe doesn't address some of the things I'm going to talk about today. So in a good deal of what I'd call left liberal political memory, the Reconstruction era and its demise are central to the narrative of a nation that for a brief moment sought to achieve substantial racial equality until this effort was dashed by the political, and economic imperatives of what has come to be known as racial capitalism of a white supremacist nation. On the other hand, the story of US expansion and conquest that occurs at the expense of indigenous peoples is often positioned, if not fully outside, then as an asterisk to or juxtaposed with the defining events and structural formations of this time. As a result, the memory of Western conquest does not usually end up as a part of the story told and lessons learned regarding the political life of race and class and radical, if lost, possibilities from this period in US history. But why not? It is not that this history of conquest is unknown or unavailable to be known, but rather that it is not acknowledged as constitutive of the nation's past when the Reconstruction era is invoked to inform our contemporary condition, as it is time and time again up to literally today. My approach here is to draw from the story of Reconstruction and the shaping roles of indigeneity, settler-colonialism, and white settlerness that are already embedded in it, but which are disavowed through settler memory. To be disavowed through settler memory means not just simply forgetting indigenous peoples or settler colonialism. There's a form of remembering in some regard, but actually disavowing, not acknowledging, not engaging the continued political importance of indigenous people and their politics and histories and lives, and of the processes of settler colonialism that all maintain and continue to be important elements in positive and negative ways of our lives today. That's what settler memory is, to both remember and disavow important elements of the world we live in. So to engage in this particular effort to draw out, I examine the canonical text of left liberal memory of the Reconstruction era, which is W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America, 1860 to 1880, published in 1935. Notably, Du Bois's book reimagines the Reconstruction era as what he calls famously a splendid failure. The splendid element in the midst of this nationwide policy failure came in the manner in which Black freedmen, people freed from slavery, in states across the South, took on, in his words, in Du Bois's words, a great and just cause, fighting the battle of the oppressed and despised humanity of every race and color. And this manifested in representatives in state houses and in the Congress, but in state houses across the South in a way that's more than anything we've seen since that time, creating public colleges, public institutions for Black and white, a real transformation for that time, a real opportunity to have substantial economic and political equality, which was then dashed by the end of Reconstruction. Now, while Black Reconstruction brought a powerful new reading of this period, a reading that defied and went against the racist reading of that period by the so-called Dunning School, while it did that, and it has influenced in much needed ways our grasp of Reconstruction, it is also a work, I argue, that's shaped by settler memory. To mark out the advances by Du Bois and to suggest that settler memory is at work in his text is not to argue that he should have written a different book. I'm arrogant. I'm not that arrogant. Or implying that Du Bois approved of indigenous people's violent treatment or dispossession. That was not at all the case, and I'd happy to expand if you'd like in the discussion. Du Bois wrote about the Reconstruction era while living through the Jim Crow era in the United States, and thus was intervening in the politics of his generation with those imperatives. So no, my intervention is not about Du Bois himself. It's about us, to push us as readers not to allow settler memory to shield us from the structural and human underlay of the story he tells about this period and our collective memory of it. To this end, attending to the story of land in Black Reconstruction offers a way to tilt the angle on this mirror a bit, so as to recast some of its embedded presumptions that forestall alternative, potentially anti-colonial imaginaries and lessons we can garner from this political memory. The period in US history from the Civil War through Reconstruction and its demise, and Du Bois sets out a period of 1860 to 1880, I'll extend it just slightly. But during this period was a time when Indigenous peoples were dispossessed of their lands in the US at a considerable rate. From the Homestead Act of 1862, all the way through to the General Allotment Act of 1887, which had its implications all the way to the 1930s. As well, during this period of 1860 to 1880s, there was notable Indigenous political resistance to settler invasion during this period, such as the Oceti-Shekoan or the Great Sioux Nation's 1866 victory over the US Army garrisoned along the Bozeman Trail, which led to the US basically submitting for a treaty, asking for a treaty, which became the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, and the Sioux and Allied victory at the Battle of Greasy Grass, also known as Little Bighorn, in 1876, when Custer bit the dust. Indigenous people also experienced intense forms of genocidal violence. Just a few samples of this horrible violence include the 1862 US state execution of 38 Dakota men in Mankato, Minnesota, signed off by Abraham Lincoln, the Great Emancipator, the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, all the way to the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890. And of course, during this period and long after it, the cultural and human genocidal violence of boarding and residential schools imposed on Indigenous children and communities, the legacy of which continues, as we well know. The history of Indigenous people's experience and US Indian policy and settler practices during this time are known, at least available to be known, but they're split off from the political story and memory of the Reconstruction era as it is popularly told, including by those on sort of the left liberal political side of the spectrum. This splitting comes at a price for how we understand our moment and look for models for our way forward as we reflect on the lessons of that historical period. Now, okay, enough pushing it off to Du Bois directly. There is a constitutive presence and absence of indigeneity and settler colonialism in Black Reconstruction. And most notably, in the book's narrative, the land dispossessed from Indigenous people is at once central to Du Bois's story, and yet Indigenous people and the settler colonial practices that produce this dispossession remain at best, barely visible to it. Take into consideration numerous references one can find in Black Reconstruction from cover to cover that form another tale that can be told regarding land. Here's just a sample of Du Bois's words from throughout the book, referring to, and I quote him now, a number of these different quotes. This is him: the continual supply of fertile land, cheaper slaves, endless land of richest fertility, free rich land and cheap labor, access to the soil, south and west to the free laborer, land hunger, this absolutely fundamental and essential thing to any real emancipation of the slaves. One clear economic ideal, and that was his demand for the land. The overthrow of Reconstruction was in essence a revolution inspired by property and not a race war. And finally, the rebuilding, whether it comes now or a century later, of course he's writing in 1935, whether it comes now or a century later, will and must go back to the basic principles of Reconstruction in the United States during 1867 to 1876. Land, light, and leading for slaves, Black, brown, yellow, and white, under a dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, the absence of red, a popular racial signifier for Indigenous people in the US schema, in this list is a product of and constitutive of the land question around which the book's narrative pivots, and of who counts as the bodies of labor to be mobilized in an alliance and who does not, who are disavowed as political subjects, linked to the land being dispossessed more than to the anti-capitalist workers' alliance being built. It is for this reason that Du Bois's own distinction between land and property is worth digging into. The distinction between references to land and to the concept of property when the discussion turns to economic redistribution policies speaks to the settler colonial structure shaping the terms of the radical politics of Reconstruction, as conveyed implicitly by Du Bois. Du Bois is assessing the situation as he finds it, with the status of property essential. I get that, and not as would necessarily fit his ideal vision of land reform in the abstract. His history and his politics are much more complicated than just this text, and I get that. And happy to discuss it if you'd like. Still, as readers of this text, we should not reproduce the slippages and elisions in this construction and the splitting off of the interrelationship of the discourse around land and that of property in the political memory of Reconstruction. On that point, Seneca scholar Mashana Goman argues that, and I quote her, a consequence of colonialism has meant a translation or too easy collapsing of land to property, a move that perpetuates the logic of containment, end quote, by which Indigenous peoples' relationships and practices with land are contained within and by settler colonial parameters. Du Bois's text does not explicitly reference this shift from the oft-repeated general desire for fertile land to the explicit political struggle over the distribution of property and income by the state. Rather, this logic of dispossession resides throughout in the background of the text as its own form of a settler colonial trace and hidden support beam of modern racial capitalism. By hidden support beam, I simply mean modern racial capitalism is built upon dispossessed land, but we very rarely talk about it. This construction of the land as property, even in a Du Boisian Marxist approach that will argue for its radical redistribution, narrowly defines the meaning of land in the system, and in so doing narrowly defines the meaning of and relationship of land to human beings and non-human life in this era and in the political memory of it. In the political memory of it as we reproduce it. It does so by reproducing the strict meaning of land as property and human beings as racialized labor. Other ways of thinking about land itself and the meaning of and relationship to bodies in life, human and non-human, are not or are rarely part of the framework here. Thus, the logic of containment regarding land to which Goman refers applies also to the status and role of human beings in the system, which are contained to the mode of labor as distinctly racialized and not even gendered in Du Bois's text, and subsequent critics have talked about this, and I'd be happy to talk about this more. Not even gendered labor, primarily racialized, disconnected from matters of land as land rather than property. Indigenous people are constitutive absences in this racialized land labor logic of containment. They are not there because they do not fit into the story of the political life of race in the United States that pivots around labor questions, not around land questions. Indigeneity and land issues in this regard upset the popular left political memory here. And I think we need to ask why. I think we know, but we got to ask. Importantly, this constitutive absence of Indigenous people also helps to reaffirm the detachment of white identity from settler identity and practices. For example, the famous Du Boisian concept of the wages of whiteness. Those weren't his words. David Roediger called them the wages of whiteness, but the concept is Du Bois's, the idea. It's a very popular referent in left political memory that denotes white working class alignment with the capitalist class via the public and psychological wages of whiteness, by which white laborers did not get much out of it materially, as low wages persist, so less in the pocketbook. But in exchange, they benefited in other non-economic ways, deference, access to voting in the courts, etc. But historian Carrie Lee Merritt points out that, and I quote her, the Homestead Act of 1862, along with the Southern Homestead Act of 1866, allowed tens of thousands of poor whites to join the ranks of landholders. Many poor whites migrated westward to seek new opportunities and economic independence. Specifically, Merritt informs us that, and I quote her, more than 1.6 million white families, both native-born and immigrant, succeeded in becoming landowners during the next several decades. Conversely, only 4,000 to 5,500 African-American claimants ever received their final land patents from the Southern Homestead Act. As she puts it, Merritt, the Homestead Acts were unquestionably the most extensive, radical, redistributive governmental policy in U.S. history. Think about that. The Homestead Acts around land were unquestionably the most extensive, radical, redistributive governmental policy in U.S. history. As we think about a third Reconstruction, why aren't we thinking about that? The lure of the material and political value, and yes, also the social and psychological value of access to land, or at least the real possibility of such access, are not usually incorporated into the explanation of the interests and identities shaping the alliances of white people at this time, which I got to say is a rather odd absence of materiality in left political memory. A little odd. If the possibility for access to land were incorporated into our grasp of this wage, we might see white working and also middle-class subjects as citizen deputies of a white settler state expansion, and also opportunities for forms of resistance. This raises the matter of the need for an anti-colonialist resistance as one lesson that might inform the politics of the present day when drawing upon the political memory of the Reconstruction era, of what we might think of as necessary in a third Reconstruction. Understanding maybe why that first Reconstruction also was a failure, splendidness notwithstanding, and why then we need to engage the role of land in relationship to labor and many other major concerns, such as gender and sexuality, more directly. To refuse the work of settler memory then, to refuse this disavowal, to engage and acknowledge here, then means to see and reimagine a shared world when indigeneity, the land question, and settler colonial economic and political development are also part of the story of the Civil War and Reconstruction, one which complicates the key concepts and claims drawn from this period, but then by that very fact, opening them up to new meanings and refiguration and possibilities for our time. For example, no post-Civil War claim by freed people is as resonant as that of 40 acres and a mule. The claim makes sense, of course, as a matter of justice and reparations in the wake of slavery. And as Du Bois makes clear, the question of bringing it into reality haunts the story of Reconstruction. However, along with the important matter of inquiring as to the source of these acres and at what group's expense, a decolonial reading of Reconstruction that accounts for indigeneity and settler colonialism pushes the matter even further to reconceive the meaning of the relationship between land and labor, and really that amongst human, non-human, and territorial bodies more generally. This runs up against the popular purpose of the invocation of the Reconstruction era focused on labor solidarity and abolitionism, not also land relations and decolonization. The issue that haunts radical scholars about Reconstruction is the lost opportunity of the cross-racial, class-based alliance of Black, brown, yellow, and white workers forming a dictatorship of the proletariat that might have abolished the economic elite property system undergirding white supremacy. But only when we first refuse the work that settler memory does to radical left and liberal collective memories can we secondly begin to decolonize the lore of this period in order to think about what it would mean to talk about an anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and anti-colonialist alliance for the transformation of the basis and distribution of land, rather than say property, that could exist in a mutually constitutive relationship with the support of Indigenous people's claims and sovereignty and their tradition in sovereignty in relationship to their traditional territories. A reading of Reconstruction that refuses the work of settler memory offers us the imaginative potential of a coexistent abolitionist and decolonization project. In this regard, refusing settler memory also reveals to us the lived history of anti-racist and decolonial governance in these lands that I'm in the lands of Turtle Island that I live. For in so doing, we are in better position to consider the implications for radical imaginaries of the fact that the Black governance of the Reconstruction era that Du Bois lauds as the splendid element of the splendid failure existed at the same time as, for example, the Sioux Nation's successful effort to force the US government into a peace agreement, the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, that recognized their claim to territory and self-governance free of white settler intrusion. Now, like the Reconstruction that was dashed, these treaties were not lived up to be sure. Still, what we can discern here is that there were at least two splendid failures, at least two, to which one can turn to recompose, recast, and project forward the political memory of this era, and ask yourself what placing these models together might then produce when imagining engaging with, say, what a third Reconstruction must look like as we talk about it more and more in our contemporary era, in an era of crisis when we needed an imaginary of a better world. As one way to bring this memory forward, I offer the notion of layers of dispossession. Layers of dispossession. Layers of dispossession means to account for the interrelationship of the dispossession of Indigenous people from much of their lands during this time, and the dispossession of Black people for much of the 40 acres or more of land promised or acquired post-emancipation from slavery. The layers of dispossession that haunted Black and Indigenous communities during this period, while distinct in many meaningful ways, very meaningful ways, also reveals resonant co-inhabitative experiences of dispossession by, domination from, and frustration with, to say the least, a white settler heteropatriarchal nation in the aftermath of the US Civil War. The layered but not collapsing connection of these social relations of dispossession are often absent from the political memories and lessons of Reconstruction, because the politics around land and around labor are usually split off or quarantined from one another, as if the former concerns Indigenous peoples alone, and the latter that of labor of workers, Black, brown, yellow, and white alone, as if labor and land questions don't influence in different ways all of us. Attending to the layering of dispossessions is a way to address Lenape scholar Joanne Barker's prescient question. If dispossession is understood as formative of the US empire, might it be necessary to treat it as a component of the economic disparity, not only of Indigenous people, but also of others so indentured within and to the state? In considering Barker's query, one should attend to tensions, to be sure, there will be, while also paying a serious attention to the fact that the post-Civil War expansionary white settler democracy was built on accelerated territorial dispossession of Indigenous nations and the deputization of white settler citizens to enact a great deal of this dispossession. It also required that the vast majority of Black people be left without wealth and property to leave them precarious and thus more readily exploitable in the political and economic system. In this regard, consider how Du Bois imagines the words of protest from Black people contesting dispossession. He says in this quote, imagining a response to what's going on from Black Americans, "What is the use of giving us freedom if we can't stay where we were raised and own our own house, where we were born, and our own piece of ground," end quote. While it has been noted by some commentators on Du Bois's work that land is central to his analysis, this has not led to a great deal of scholarship that centers the analysis on the practices of dispossession against Black Americans as a critical feature of the story of the political life of race in the United States. The usual narratives focus on the loss of access to property, strictly understood, but less regarding the experiences and memories of Black people's relationship to lands that are not necessarily centered in a property logic, but which speak to a deeper form of relationality that seems lost to political memory. But what if such stories of place were not lost or disavowed in the political memory of Reconstruction? What might be the implications for lessons and opportunities for coalitional projects, the relationship of abolitionism to decolonization, that refuse the labor-land binary and the siloing of peoples away from one another who in fact co-inhabited and continue to struggle on these lands? And I'll wrap up very soon. To this end, an approach that refuses the settler memory of the Reconstruction era reveals to us a period of time when radical Black and Indigenous governance did co-inhabit on these lands, even for brief and staggered moments in time. We can remember this period as defined by splendid failures, plural, and work and rework radical critiques and imaginaries from there. These coexistent set of Black and Indigenous political projects did not come to fruition as promised, but they remain available to political memory in the effort to challenge, rethink, and fuel contemporary ideas about radical liberation and solidarity, and think through and imagine how to indeed build a better world. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Kevin, thank you so much. That was deeply stimulating, and I know you're writing very much from your place, from Turtle Island, about the particular histories of land dispossessions that have happened there. But I think the stories that you tell are deeply resonant, have very strong similarities here. in so-called Australia. I'm interested, so a reminder to people, please use the Q&A function. We'd love to hear your questions for Kevin. I was struck towards the end there of the way in which you're linking abolition and decolonization struggles. That's very much, again, something that resonates very strongly here. I think some of the staunchest decolonial activists, sovereignty activists in Australia are also at the forefront of the abolition movement here. There's been a relatively recent development, I think, that the language of abolition coming to the forefront in these struggles in Australia. The language of decolonization has been around for longer, and I think here we can see some of the differences in history, because you know, the enslavement of Black bodies was also part of a colonial project, and so the links between dispossession of First Nations from their lands on Turtle Island and the dispossession by removal of enslaved peoples from their lands has towards the same project of building a heteropatriarchal white capitalist colony. Here, I think we did have a history of slavery here as well. There was a recent, with our thankfully now previous Prime Minister, tried to assert in the media last year that there was no history of slavery here, and got thoroughly smacked around the head for that in the media, as he quite rightly deserved. But that history is, again, one of those hidden histories in Australia, or it's less well known. I mean, none of these settler memories and histories are taught properly in our schools. But I'm wondering where you see those movements going, those linked movements of decolonization and abolition in Turtle Island, across Turtle Island. You know, you started by you know, of course, reminding us of the ways that colonization and capitalism are so deeply connected and embedded with one another. Is there a chance of progress without dismantling capitalism? What are the possibilities of these struggles within a capitalist social economic structure? Just a small question to start with.
Sorry?
Just a small question to start with.
Well, I don't think there's a chance I think dismantling capitalism is such a big sort of like imaginary for us, but I certainly, there's not a chance in which we're actually like, I mean, I teach, so just to set up, I teach at a business college, and I teach whatever I teach. So it's, you know, anti-capitalism, I teach issues around colonial resistance. And the way I phrase it for my students who are learning how to be entrepreneurs is, I'm not saying that you need to be an anti-capitalist, although I'm not going to stop you from going in that direction. But you actually need to see the way that the system functions, how it shapes the relationship to work, to labor, to home, to property. And it shapes everything in a way that, for a vast majority of people, the society is deeply and fundamentally and structurally oppressive. And structurally oppressive in a way that is shaped along race, gender, and colonialist lines. And so if we're not putting capitalism at the center of this discussion, then that is another form of a fundamental disavowal. It can't be forms of like representational politics without resources and deep engaging with issues of economics, materiality, and the structure of capitalism. I think that in terms of the question about forms of collaborations, part of it, and I talk in the later part of the book and sort of weave it through, but certainly in the later part of the book, is about how I do see very much what's going on is, say, Black Lives Matter in alliance with Standing Rock, and talking about things such as the water that's being poisoned in Flint, Michigan, and the water that's threatened with the Dakota people in the lands of the Oceti-Sakowin, and that the language of water is life is meant to connect all in terms of issues of challenge and determination to address these forms of oppressions and violations that are from colonialism and capitalism. And I think that the missions of abolitionism and decolonization have a lot of ways in which they do fundamentally can and do speak to each other, but they don't always. And I think in the US context coming out of Du Bois, and this is again not on Du Bois, the language of an abolition democracy is pretty prolific in left circles. and I've had this experience because I was still on the Collective for Abolition, which is a journal of insurgent politics, and we've had great work, and I'm with wonderful, amazing comrades and colleagues. But the questions of land and decolonization trouble a lot of the ways that people think about this notion of creating a better world. There are certain folks who raise questions about the language of the commons, right? And then we think about where that land of the commons is going to come from. Have understandings of indigenous sovereignty that I think are much more in line with settler notions of sovereignty, what they think indigenous sovereignty is, rather than understanding what indigenous communities and their diversity are saying. So I think those challenges have to be overcome to not disavow questions around issues of land and territory sovereignty, and to not see them necessarily in tension with abolitionist imperatives. And I think that they're both have a similar target point in capitalism, but I think we have to think about the specific formations of capitalism historically and geographically, and how it produces in terms of wage labor and territorial forms of reproduction and dispossession. So I think I see, and I try to end with a lot of forms of alliances. I'm saying I think part of what these systems do, whether it's racialization, colonialism, heteropatriarchy, they also shape and direct us to see what they need us to see and not see what's actually right in front of our faces, which is part of what settler memory is meant to do. A lot of these things are actually, I think, going on, and how settler memory works is to not see what's right in front of our face, which is the way I feel about the Reconstruction era. When I was going back and not only rereading Du Bois's great book, but also looking at the era itself, I was like, all this material is right there, but it's right in front of our faces, but we don't incorporate it. What would it mean to do so? And I think that's what the project seeks to do, is in many ways see what I think is right in front of our eyes and engage with it, not just as a saying, but as an acknowledgement, and maybe helping to shape some of our political commitments and possible coalitions.
Yeah, I love that. I used to teach a first year politics course that in my head was subtitled Liberalism. It's all a trick. It is very much about teaching people to see what's right in front of them that is inherently problematic, but served up to us as not only not problematic, but actually the answer to our problems. Mm-hmm. A couple of great questions have come in from the audience today. The first one, the memory of the Reconstruction era is deeply tied to the politics of US constitutionalism. Legal scholars debate the extent to which the Reconstruction redeemed the Constitution. Your account, as well as many others, trouble this. Could you speak to the relationship between constitutional memory and promise on one hand and decolonization on the other? Do you see the possibilities for constitutional redemption as a result of this decolonial memory of the Reconstruction?
Yeah, I think of Aziz Rana at Cornell in the law school there is going to have, I think Aziz's book is going to come out next little while about forms of constitutional, the idolization, the iconization of the Constitution, especially in the 20th century. So I'd look for Aziz Rana's book to elaborate on some of these questions. But what I would say is I don't see the possibilities for constitutional redemption through my understanding of decolonial memory, or at least if I did, I'm not as worried about constitutional redemption, but if I was to actually invoke the Constitution, which I'm loath to do, but if I was, I would do it in a very direct way to start with, which is to take, for example, the Treaty of Fort Laramie. Treaties in the Constitution are supposed to be the supreme law of the land. So if we wanted to invoke the Constitution as a type of redemption for the Reconstruction project, one would be to really think about the specificity of the amendments that were passed at that period and what they meant in a substantial way. But another way in terms of decolonization, or at least the beginning of it, I don't think it's decolonization if you still have the US Constitution as part of the plenary, as fundamental to the plenary power of the United States, settler colonial state. But treaties are the law of the land. If we were to actually live up to the treaties committed, the over 370 signed, sealed, and delivered treaties, including the Fort Laramie Treaty, that would change a lot of relationships, governing relationships, territorial relationships in the US. It would be part of certainly a step in the right direction of a reconstruction. I don't know if that's redemption of the Constitution, or as some say, making the Constitution live up to the very basic promises it seems to make. I do think a radical Reconstruction that involves a real abolition of democracy and decolonization would have to be a rethinking of what the U.S. or what governing a community is on these lands. And whether that means the Constitution is part of that or not would be, I think it would be questionable. But I think in terms of some of the things I'm talking about, there are very clear ways in which one could invoke the power of the Constitution to call forth the demands for the United States. And the United States is a party to, and all the citizens, all of us who are citizens are a part of these treaties. That's our obligation to make sure they're lived up to. So that would be a way in which the Constitution could and should be invoked to say, at the very least, and it is the least, there's much more to do, that we have an obligation to live up to those treaties, which would be a radical change in governance and land relations in many ways for a good portion of, but certainly not all of what's called the United States.
Wonderful, thank you. These are very live questions here, of course, with questions of changes to our Constitution and emerging treaty processes in several subnational jurisdictions at the moment. So very live questions down here. A wonderful question now from my colleague Chris Healy. How would you connect the land/property distinction that you've drawn attention to in Du Bois to concepts of sovereignty, which I think of as central to decolonization?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's something that I probably thought about a little bit more with my first book, with The Third Space of Sovereignty, in which I try to disconnect sovereignty from being understood as settler state forms of policed borders and a very fierce sort of like property regime within a Eurocentric settler state. And so I just want to look at the question, make sure I've got it down. I think the land property distinction, if we're going to sort of talk about relationalities to land, I think we're in the relations to land and relationality, not only with Indigenous peoples, but I think all of us to think about how we all be good relatives relationship to land. I think that goes hand in hand with reimagining, but also invoking forms of sovereignty that are not militarized state forms of Eurocentric sovereignty that we're familiar with, state borders, border imperialism that defines the common and predominant hegemonic notions of sovereignty. So I think rethinking land relations goes hand in hand with rethinking or invoking or centering forms of ideas and practices of sovereignty that are not based upon, in similarly the way a property distinction would talk about bounded, commodified, defended borders of property, bounded and defended borders of a state. And so I think those two, it's a good question, and I'd have to sort of expand upon it more, but I think part of what probably stuff that I thought about for the first book is that we have to, in the way I'm thinking about, we have to think about a relationship to property in a reconstruction. I think we always have to be rethinking and not accepting the dominant forms of sovereignty that are set out for us as the only choice to think about how we govern and have forms of autonomy and relations on these lands. But it's a good question. I think, I'm not sure if I'm answering as well as I could, but I think it's those dynamics and connections are certainly necessary. I don't think one can happen without the other.
Thank you. A couple of questions here from Britt. We'll see how we go getting through them. The first one is, you mentioned the coexistence of Indigenous and Black governance during Reconstruction. I'd love to hear more about what that looked like during that period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, about the coexistence. And obviously in the chapter, I'm able to lay this out a little more. I don't necessarily mean that these communities were working together or in conversation, although I have, be interesting. I've not done the research to think about whether that was the case. But what I mean to say is that they co-inhabited, coexisted at the same time in these lands, fighting for, or arguing, or articulating forms of self-governance. And part of what I'm trying to refuse there and offer an alternative is the notion of the normative notion of self-governance, of self-determination, of being able to take care of one's community are normally constructed as white settler masculine. And part of the narrative that W.E.B. Du Bois pushes back against, the so-called Dunning School, is that Reconstruction failed because Black people couldn't govern themselves. They were not able to. They were not, all the racialized language, and that the North imposed this upon it. And you had these carpetbaggers coming down, and it was all a failure as a project because Black people weren't up to it, which Du Bois proves was a racist lie. And similarly, in terms of Indigenous people self-governing, fighting for their own rights, territory, demanding demanding or getting demanded from them or asked from them, the US government, for treaties, that their own self-governance was in place at the same time. And so it wasn't so much that people were in alliance or working together, although there's a history, of course, Black, Indigenous, Maroon communities and connections. But in this regard, I wanted to really center forms of Indigenous and Black forms of governance in their own ways, in terms of Black Americans within the US constitutional system, within Southern states, within the Congress, for Indigenous communities, in terms of their own territories, own communities, own forms of social, economic, and governing relations, constructed and affirmed, at least for a while, in a treaty with the United States. And to think about what does that mean to talk about, if we're invoking this memory so often, as I said, literally today in the New York Times, why aren't we engaging with, actually, in terms of the splendid failures, those particular moments of ideals of self-governance, self-determination that are not built, not to say anything's perfect, but not built on the forms of oppressions that we see with the white settler state. So that's what I mean by the coexistence. I didn't mean to imply that they were actually working together, but I wanted to think about what it means when we're invoking this memory, that this was going on at the same time. And this is the splendid part of the splendid failure that Du Bois and those of us calling upon him go back to. Like, this was a moment in which you actually saw Black self-governance, people working together to have substantial economic and political equality that was for Black and white people, and Black, white, you said, Asian, all brown people, Latinx people, whoever was on these lands, and to make sure that Indigenous people are part of that project.
Another question from Britt that I think we have time for. You talked about the failure to think of the promise of 40 acres and a mule in decolonial terms to challenge the labor/land binary as essential to Reconstruction's failure. Could you explain this a bit more? In what ways do you understand this binary as having produced Reconstruction's failure?
It's a great question. So obviously 40 acres and a mule is the reproduced sort of like claim about providing economic basis for political freedom to freedmen. And obviously entirely justified, and one makes complete sense, because the fundamental argument was political freedom without economic support is going to end up being pretty thin and meaningless. You need economic support for that. Du Bois himself says that the Reconstruction era crashed on the property question. Once it became redistribution of property, that's when it was giving up political rights was one thing, right? Suddenly, when you have substantial economic redistribution, that's when it crashed. And that's when the labor coalition suddenly falls apart in terms of, the so-called wages of whiteness, which I try to expand a little more. What I'm saying there is maybe the focus on property itself, the very logic of property itself, became the way in which different interests were pitted against each other. Instead of thinking about land relations and the way in which people were seeing land as important to certainly value and economic value and security, but also a sense of home and connection. And if we were to rethink the relationship to land in our, not going back to that time and wishing they did it, but as we think about economic support, material support, relationship to community and freedom, if we're thinking about in terms of land and land relationality, Indigenous claims and rights to ancestral land and traditional territories and present territories, and how we be good relatives in relationship to that, certainly there's going to be tensions. It's not to say there won't be tensions, but I don't think it sets up what property sets up. Property is not only a relationship to land, property is a relationship to one another. I have property and you can't come on here. I have property and I can sell it or own it. Property is a relationship to other people, not simply land. In fact, it's fundamentally about relationships to other people. A very distinct competitive form of relationship to other people, one that evokes a notion of negative freedom. Leave me alone, I stay in my house and you stay away from me. A notion of relationality to land doesn't have to invoke that same sort of notion of splitting people off. Because what property does is divides people. And so is there another way to think about land relations that don't divide people? And I think, not that Du Bois could have figured this, but I think that way in which property became the way to think about it, certainly for you have northern, southern elite interests, they don't want to share property. You can completely see why they're pushing back against it. But for the so-called like cross class racial coalition of whites, I'm not saying that white working class people did great. I do think that land was much more of a material basis, but what if there was another way to think about and practice how we live together? And I think that sort of way in which that binary gets split off in terms of what land means as property and the very sort of poor compensation people are getting for labor end up not that I'm relieving people of responsibility, left white working class people with sort of looking at two options. And I wonder if there's another way to think about how this binary ended up really having a contributive factor for why it failed. And having to rethink the relationship to land and to labor in many ways is what I think we need to do on a third Reconstruction if we're going to really imagine this better world, because we can't reproduce the mistakes of the past. And I think too often, without it thinking about land in a much more complicated way, we're threatening to do so.
Land, yes. This last question that we can squeeze in also raises the question of land, which is, you know, kind of the irreducible element in all of these conversations, I think. So this is from Alana Lenton. What I see at the moment are many non-performatives that turn decolonization and abolition into empty signifiers, but acting collectively to return land beyond the scant individual actions that exist and should be commended cannot be said to exist here. We can use the ideas raised by your talk to think about alliance building between Indigenous people and other peoples who are here for various reasons that are not really based on choice. But when it comes to white colonizers, should we not at least be talking about what a politics of self-dispossession would look like? Can we give back?
Oh, sorry. What's that?
Can we give the land back?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that land back commitments that involve working in collaboration with white settlers, but I think working in collaboration with Indigenous communities, non-Indigenous communities, non-white communities who are thinking about relationships to community and to land and how we live together is fundamental to it. I think we absolutely been talking about it and theorizing about it. I think this is where abolition and decolonization meets, right? Because an abolition democracy is about abolishing capitalism. So if we're going to be abolishing capitalism, we're going to be abolishing property relations. And so therefore we need to think about relationships to land and to community and territory and materiality in a different way. And so if we're going to be abolitionists, I think we need to be engaged in decolonization. An abolitionist project should fundamentally involve forms of self-dispossession or dispossession of the claims to property and territory of white colonizers. And that's part of what I see abolitionists sometimes, and not always, because I know a lot of great colleagues who are doing this work, sometimes leave off the table, or do so in a way, as I invoked earlier, that invoke this notion of a commons, and we just all have the commons together and not think about the relationship of Indigenous communities to that land that's been produced as the commons. And I think those are some of the difficult dispossessions. But in terms of your question, Alana, yes, absolutely. I've been talking about it, but also thinking about in conversation engagement with communities, what that would look like, what would be the process, how do we demand it and move forward on it? It's a great question, thought.
It's wonderful. Thanks, Kevin. That brings us just about up to time. And so therefore, just about to the end of both this session with Kevin Bruyneel and the Critical Public Conversation series for 2020, the last in the series Undoing Australia. We look forward to welcoming all of you back in 2023. Our research theme for next year and the theme of the Critical Public Conversation series is climate, colonialism, and goodness me, I should remember this. Climate, colonizer, oh my goodness me. I'm going to have to read the words on my piece of paper. Country, climate, and colonialism. Oh, it's the end of the year, guys. Where we take some of the provocations exactly as Kevin has raised them, to look at questions of why, given the impending climate catastrophe that we face, we are unable to reckon with that. And we look to some of the ways in which ongoing settler colonization is implicit in hampering our efforts. So we're working on a very exciting lineup of speakers for next year. We hope you will join us. More details of that will be coming through very soon. But for now, please join me in thanking Kevin Bruyneel for rounding out this year's series, helping us undo not only Australia, but Turtle Island. It's been wonderful to have so many of you join us. Hundreds and hundreds of you have tuned in for this series this year. The recordings are all available on our website if you've missed any of them. And we look forward to another exciting series of Critical Public Conversations in 2023. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.